Welcome, everybody. So today is the second session in a series that we're doing to help MSPs understand the basics of email security. And today we're going to be talking about DMARC. It is a protocol for authenticating emails that is becoming very important and very relevant. So it's going to be something you want to understand how to manage, how to implement, because your customers are going to need it to ensure proper email deliverability going forward. My name is Mark Glowacz. I'm the Vice President of Partner Success here at Mailprotector. I was an MSP myself for about a decade before coming to Mailprotector, so I have a little sense of what you guys do day to day. And email is, something that we all know is incredibly important to us, to your clients. So getting email right is almost expected. And when things go wrong, that's when your clients get pretty upset because it's one of those technologies that we take for granted until something doesn't work right. And that's when you hear a lot of noise from your clients. So we're going to do our best to try to give you guys the information here about DMARC that is going to be very important to making sure your clients' emails are getting to their intended recipients. Before we jump into DMARC, I'm going to very quickly refresh our memories on SPF and DKIM because those are two protocols that need to be implemented before DMARC even really works. If you haven't attended last month's webinar that we did on SPF and DMARC, we do have that recorded. We'll do a real quick refresher here just to make sure everybody's on the same page. So starting with SPF, or Sender Policy Framework, this is going to be based on the IP address of the sending email server. So when someone sends an email, the receiving server is going to contact a DNS server for that sending domain and ask, this email that's coming from this particular IP address, is that IP address authorized to send an email on behalf of that sending domain? If it's authenticated, then that message will go on to the recipient. If not, if it fails SPF, then that message will be rejected. So when I say rejected, it could be, going to the junk email folder, it could be quarantined, or depending on how a receiving server is set up, it could even bounce the message. But the thing to really remember with SPF is it's based on the IP address that sends that email and whether that IP address has been authorized to send messages on behalf of that domain. Next is DKIM, or Domain Keys Identified Mail. And this has to do with making sure that the email hasn't been changed between the sending server and the recipient's server. And the way it does that is through a digital signature. So when the sender sends that email, it uses a private key to create a DKIM hash. So that hash is embedded into the email header. When the receiving server takes a look at that and sees that there is a DKIM signature in it, then it goes to the DNS server for that sending domain and checks the public key against the signature that is in that email header. If the signature checks out okay against that public key, then it's considered a good authentic message that hasn't been messed with, and it'll move on to the recipient. If the DKIM check fails against that public key, then it's going to end up in spam or being rejected, depending on what the receiving server is configured for. So DKIM is about making sure that the message itself was not changed between the sender and the recipient. Now let's talk about DMARC. DMARC, or Domain-Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Conformance. It's a mouthful. DMARC is incredibly important because SPF and DKIM alone, they are kind of missing an element that doesn't protect people against spoofing and impersonation. And that is one of the biggest problems that we face today as IT administrators and email administrators. So DMARC was created to help fill in that gap a little bit. And the way DMARC works from a high level is the sender sends the message when the receiving server gets that message. It takes a look at DNS for the DMARC policy of the from address that is visible to the user, and then checks that against the DKIM and the SPF records for alignment. I know that may not make sense at the moment. We're going to dive into that here in a little bit. But that's what DMARC is doing, is it's taking a look at the from address that is visible to the receiving or to the recipient, and then checking to see if it aligns with the sending domains, DKIM and SPF checks. Depending on how that DMARC policy is configured, whether it's going to reject or quarantine or maybe do nothing, if DMARC passes, then of course the email is going to be delivered to the recipient. But if the DMARC record does not align with DKIM and SPF, if it's a quarantine policy, it'll send the message to the junk email folder or quarantine. Or if the policy is set to reject, then it will bounce the message. The key thing to remember about DMARC is it is not looking at the sender, or in other words, the envelope sender or the SPF in particular. It is looking at the domain in the from address, the one that shows up in the email client for a user, and comparing that against the sending domains DKIM and SPF checks for alignment. So let's kind of dive into that a little bit deeper so that hopefully it'll make more sense. And by the way, guys, this is kind of a difficult thing to understand. So, if you have questions, go ahead and throw those into chat. I'll do my best to cover this, but I'll talk about towards the end other places you can go to get more information about DMARC. So before we dive into those details, what are the advantages of DMARC and why does this even exist? So like I said, it does build on SPF and DKIM authentication because it's filling that gap of the spoofing and the impersonation that we often see with the from address, which is what a user is going to see in their email client. So this helps everybody's domain create a bit more trust, and it makes it a little bit harder for bad actors to spoof or impersonate, because now we're connecting that from address, that display address, to the actual authentication that's done by SPF and DKIM. Now, the disadvantages to this is the fact that it is kind of complex. It can be a little hard to understand, and there is initial effort that is required to make all of this work, right? First and foremost, you have to have SPF and DKIM configured correctly. Otherwise, the alignment for DMARC is not going to work out. DMARC isn't perfect. There are potential false positives, and we'll talk about that in a little bit here too. And it's not an end-all be-all. It doesn't solve some of these security issues like the spoofing and impersonation in a perfect way. It's got holes still, and a lot of it really comes down to compromised mailboxes, right? If the wolf is in the hen house, it's kind of too late. It's very hard to kind of come back from something like that. So compromised mailboxes, the DMARC protocol doesn't necessarily solve that problem. And then the reporting of DMARC, while it is very helpful, it can be complex to understand. And I'll show some examples just to kind of give everybody a sense of what that reporting looks like and how to use it. One of the ways that I like to explain things is through analogies, and I think DMARC compared to like a certified piece of US Postal Service mail is a great way to try to understand this. So here we have postal, a piece of snail mail. We have an envelope with an address of who it's coming from. We have an address of who it's going to. And then inside of that envelope is a letter or the contents of an email. When we talk about SPF, SPF is, again, that IP address. Where is this email coming from? And is it an authorized location, right? That's what that from address on the envelope, or we often call it the sender, the envelope sender. The DKIM portion, that is looking at that envelope, looking at that message, making sure that nobody's messed with it, nobody's changed it from the time it was sent to the time it gets to the recipient. That's kind of like the post office stamping the message for certified mail that, yep, it's intact as it made its way to the recipient. DMARC is now looking at who that message is coming from in the actual letter, right? In the contents of the message. When somebody opens their email in Outlook or whatever email client they're using, whether it's a smartphone or some type of tablet, the from address that they see in that email, that is what DMARC is looking at to compare it to or to align it to the SPF and DKIM authentication. So hopefully this analogy helps. It's not perfect, but it does give you a sense of those differences. And really the main thing to remember is DMARC is really concerned with that display from address. The envelope sender is what is used for SPF. DMARC is looking at the from address. So what does a DMARC record look like? It is a DNS record, and it is a TXT record type, which is very similar to SPF. SPF and DMARC are both TXT records. The format of that DMARC record is going to start with a target or a host name. It's going to be underscore DMARC dot, and then whatever the domain is. And in this case, remember, it's the sending domain or the from address that is going to show up, or as the domain in the from address that's going to show up. That then starts with this record of v equals DMARC1. That's just simply the syntax to say that this is a DMARC record and it's on version 1. The p equals is the policy designation. So in this case here, we're showing p equals none, which is telling the world that when the DMARC record is checked, even if the alignment fails, don't do anything about it. It's basically just in a reporting mode at this point. The RUA is where those reports should go. And in this case, it's going to be an email address, and it always will be an email address. And the way the DMARC reporting works is the recipient servers that support the reporting, they're going to periodically send an XML file to this email address to report what has been happening as messages get delivered from this domain. Hopefully that all makes sense. This screenshot down here that you see, this is actually from one of those DMARC reporting tools. It's showing that Mailprotector.com has a DMARC record with a policy of quarantine. It does say that the SPF record is present and it is set to a hard failure, which is the -all, and that DKIM has been identified as being present. So we'll kind of look at some of these examples as well. The main thing to know is when you're setting up DMARC, these are kind of the minimum requirements. You have to identify the fact that it is a DMARC record. You do have to pick a policy, and then you have to tell it where the reports are going to go. Everything else is going to default to kind of the behaviors that are assumed as part of the DMARC policy. And by and large, for most small and medium businesses, you're not going to need to change those very much. This will probably be all you need. So let's take a look at some of this stuff. I think it's going to be easier to understand if we can look at some examples. So I'm going to demonstrate using one of these reporting tools and kind of show you how this ends up looking when you start implementing DMARC. So I'm going to hop out here for a moment and head over. So I'm going to use Dmarcian. There are a lot of other providers for DMARC reporting. There's, oh boy, SendMarc, EasyDMARC, PowerDMARC. If you do a search for DMARC reporting services, you're going to find a lot of them. And there's really good ones out there. I happen to be using Dmarcian in this case, but there's really not one that I would say is the one to go to. You kind of need to find the one that makes the most sense for you. And a lot of them are also starting to have partner programs that'll help you kind of manage your clients in kind of a way that is a little bit more aligned to how MSPs function. So I'm going to hop into here. All right. So this is what the Dmarcian reporting looks like. Each one of these DMARC reporting services is going to look a little bit different. So if you're using a different service and you're familiar with something else, obviously this is going to look a little different from what you're used to. But this dashboard is going to show me at a very high level, you know, what is my email pattern for Mailprotector.com look like? And in this case, it's only for 7 days. Some services will give you 14 days, others will give you 30 days or more. You do have to often pay for that service to give you more history. But by and large, I would say a week is probably enough data to just kind of keep an eye on the domains that you're managing to make sure things are looking correct. So the source compliance, this is where I usually start to make sure that we have our alignment correct with the services that we use most often. So the top 3 here are what it's showing. Mailprotector does use HubSpot for our sales processes. So as you would imagine, we send a lot of emails from there. And it's something interesting to note is SPF is showing up as 0%, but DKIM is really high, 99.9%. I'm going to come back to this here in a moment, but you can see that the DMARC alignment is 99.9%, which is great. That's what we want. SPF identified servers. This is going to be servers that Mailprotector has said through SPF, yes, those are authorized to send messages on behalf of Mailprotector. They don't always have DKIM signatures, and it can be because the service that is sending the message may not support DKIM, or there could be something a little off about the ability to determine the DKIM signature of that message. So this is something we see, and again, I'll dive into this a little bit more as well, because that is an area where you can sometimes identify where are you missing things from an SPF or a DKIM standpoint that could be aligned better for the domain. Mailprotector uses Zendesk for our support process, and here you can see that our alignment there is very good. Zendesk does a great job of providing documentation on how to set up SPF and DKIM, so that alignment to DMARC ends up working very well. So let's take a look at this in a little more detail. So HubSpot here, if I expand this, this is going to show me, the fact that the domain sent this many emails in the last week, and here's that breakdown. If I go into the detailed view, this is just going to break this down a little bit more. And unfortunately, we don't have the time to kind of dive into the details of how to interpret all of this on this webinar. But it's important to note that this is how you're going to use that reporting to understand where you may be missing alignment. What's interesting about HubSpot is the SPF alignment shows up as 0%. There's something about the way HubSpot's SPF works that the DMARC reporting always shows this as 0%. HubSpot even has a knowledge-based article about it. But fortunately, their documentation also shows that as long as the DKIM alignment, those DKIM signatures coming from HubSpot's infrastructure, sending emails on behalf of Mailprotector, still ensure that DMARC is aligned so the emails do authenticate and are therefore considered highly deliverable. But if this were something other than HubSpot, that I maybe wasn't sure that SPF was working correctly, but I knew that that service or application should be allowed to send emails on behalf of the domain, this would be my clue that, oh, I should probably go and find out what's missing and make sure that that is included in my SPF record. That's where the DMARC reporting really becomes beneficial. So if we come back out to the domain overview, you can also see that the mailprotector.com DMARC policy is set to quarantine. If I click on this, in this particular case, again, every DMARC service provider is going to be a little bit different. It does show me what I'm using for my DMARC policy, what is in DNS, and where is it here? Here it is. So here's the P equals quarantine, confirming for me that that is the state of our current DMARC record. Let's talk about that policy for a moment, because we get a lot of questions about what does it mean to have none versus quarantine versus reject. And then of course, what is the best practice? When you're getting started with DMARC, I highly recommend that you start with a policy of none, because very often, especially client domains, clients don't necessarily know where they're sending emails from. And you may not actually get all the information until you implement that DMARC policy and start to collect some of this information. So it's always a good idea to start with a policy of none, start collecting this information, start looking at these reports and identifying what are the sources of email for that domain, and then make sure that you have the proper alignment for what that client's needs are. That's really the best way to start. And I would say if there's a lot of email volume, you can probably get away with having a policy of none for just a couple of weeks. Smaller businesses, or maybe businesses that don't have very much email volume, maybe you make that 30 days. But you want to have enough of a window of data to ensure that you have an understanding of where emails are coming from and is the alignment appropriately set up. Once you have that alignment understood, that's when you want to take the step of going to a quarantine policy. The quarantine policy is going to tell receiving servers that if DMARC alignment is not passing, go ahead and deliver the message, but put it into the quarantine, the junk email, whatever the receiving server is using for questionable messages. That is where you want to get to as soon as you can, because that helps protect that domain against the spoofing, against the impersonation, against being used in ways that don't align with the authorized IP addresses and the DKIM signatures that are sending messages on behalf of that domain. The ideal situation is to get to a point where your policy is reject. You'll notice Mailprotector still is not at reject. We want to really be certain that all of our sources, basically all the places where we send emails, are accounted for, they are set up correctly, and that we're not going to potentially try to send emails to somebody and have them outright reject, because the policy of reject, while that is considered the best practice for DMARC, It is literally telling receiving servers that if DMARC fails, bounce the message. The recipient's never going to get it. They're never going to know that the email was even attempted to be sent because that bounce is going to go back to the original sender of the message. Again, that is best practice, but very often you're probably going to sit in this quarantine policy for a bit until you are really sure that you have everything accounted for that domain's sending sources. Hopefully that helps. Again, this is a pretty big topic. What I really encourage everybody to do is, take a look at some of these services. Like I said, there's Dmarcian, EasyDMARC, SendMarc, and they all have good resources. They all have even wizards and guides to kind of walk you through some of this stuff. Some of them even have kind of free classes or courses that'll dive into all of this a little bit deeper so that you can understand the implications and how this DMARC alignment of the from address is associated with those SPF and DKIM authentication checks. It's a very important concept to understand because the entire email world is now moving in a direction that is requiring this to be in place. Google, Yahoo, Microsoft now has jumped on board as well. If you don't have a DMARC policy in place, then those services may not accept email messages. Today, just to kind of assuage any anxieties about what I just said, today, those three services, they're not enforcing that strictly unless the domain sends more than 5,000 messages per month. I think for most of us that are on this call, our clients, our domains ourselves, we're not those types of high volume email senders. We're not sending 5,000 messages per month necessarily. So that's not going to really be a concern for those small and medium-sized businesses, but it's still a good practice because it's only going to become more important to have these DMARC policies in place. And if you don't have them, like I said, some of these services are just going to outright start rejecting messages. Microsoft is doing something interesting. If the DMARC policy is not in place, or the DMARC record, or we've even seen recently that if an SPF record is in place and does not have the hard fail, the dash all, if instead the SPF record has the tilde all, which is considered a soft fail, or the question mark all, which is almost like a, hey, don't do anything about it. It's almost like another reporting kind of setting. In those cases, so not a hard fail of SPF or no DMARC record at all, Microsoft in 365 is showing users an unverified sender warning in Outlook. It's a very interesting way to handle that. I do think that's actually beneficial, but it is yet another sign of a large email service provider taking a step to really enforce the fact that all sending domains really need to start having SPF and DMARC implemented and configured correctly. So this is something that I encourage everybody to really dive deeper into, make sure you understand, and just start preparing to make this a part of your service delivery for all your clients, whether it's a sole proprietor or a medium business with 1,000 employees. Anybody sending emails is going to need to do this. There is a very cool resource, so dmarc.io. This is something else that I would encourage everybody to check out. So when you are starting to set this up and you start looking at the DMARC reports and you see different sources, dmarc.io is a great place to come and make sure that things are set up correctly or get an idea of what is supported, what is not. So for example, we talked about HubSpot. So if I do HubSpot here and search for that as a source, I can see it is a source. It does have compliance via SPF and DKIM. And if I expand it, this site gives me a quick access to some knowledge-based articles from HubSpot, gives me some DMARC capabilities at a glance. So this is a great place to come in and just kind of make sure, is that source even known about? What resources do I have? And it even goes into forwarders and some other information that again, for this webinar is a little too far in the weeds, but it's a great resource to come in and check on things to make sure, is a forwarding situation accounted for and what can I do to maybe better align it in that situation? Very commonly, what is it, like Mailgun, I think is a common forwarder. So it'll show you here that DMARC and DKIM remains intact when Mailgun forwarding is used. And again, if we expand that, it does give you some quick links to knowledge-based articles to make sure that the forwarding process of something like Mailgun is accounted for those DMARC behaviors. So keep this one also in mind. DMARC.io. It's a great resource when you're kind of stuck looking at those DMARC reports and trying to figure out what are we supposed to do next. Yes, and I completely agree, especially when you're just getting started with learning about DMARC. What I can encourage you to do the most is to get that very basic DMARC policy in place for the domains that you manage, being the policy equals none, and then use something, whether it's a service like Dmarcian, SendMarc, EasyDMARC, to start getting those reports. For those of you that don't like paying a monthly fee for something like that, there are open source tools out there that will also do the DMARC reporting, so you can like send all of that information to an email address that you have, point that open source tool to that email address to pull in those XML files. But again, that's kind of outside the scope of this webinar. You have to be familiar with open source tools and setting up and managing things like that on your own. So that's yet another learning curve. But the point being, get started by setting up those DMARC records on domains with a policy of none, and make sure that you're able to capture and interpret those reports to get a sense of where are emails coming from? What are the sources of that domain's emails? And then just kind of chip away at making sure they're all accounted for. Great question. So let's start with SPF. You do want to include both 365 and Mailprotector's SPF include statements. The reason being is you can't guarantee that all of your email from 365 is going to go through Mailprotector's relay. Think about things like a classic example is a calendar invitation. Another one is, OneDrive or SharePoint emails that are, sharing a file or a folder. Often the way Microsoft sends those messages, they go out directly from 365's infrastructure. They don't actually pass through the Exchange Online connectors. So for that reason, you now have to account for 365 still being the source of messages, not just Mailprotector's relay. So yes, it is important to include both 365 and Mailprotector's include statement. DKIM is a little less important. Well, and to begin with, if you're using SafeSend, SafeSend does not do a DKIM signature. We don't change the message. We're just evaluating that message on its way out for reputation, for a malicious intent, for spam, things like that. But the DKIM signature that you set up in 365, that remains intact going through the SafeSend relay. So DKIM is fine, just set up in 365. Great question. And I love the fact that somebody caught that and pointed it out. So one of the things that we know is the impersonation and spoofing attempts that we see. They often start with somebody's name showing up in that email in the Outlook client or whatever email client the user is looking at. So I could see that a message is coming from John Doe, but behind the scenes in the header, that envelope sender may have been Jane Doe. And this is where DMARC becomes very important, right? So instead of Jane Doe and John Doe, let's make this more like organizational. Let's say this from address, instead of it being Jane Doe, was a widget company. So widget company has sent me this message. John Doe works for widget company. So I'm communicating with John at the widget company. So I do trust that. And what DMARC is saying is John Doe works at widget company. The email, the envelope sender is coming from widget company. So that does align. DMARC's check against the SPF record, right? The server it's coming from. And then of course the DKIM, the message was not altered between the sender and the recipient. So DMARC aligns with the fact that John Doe does work at widget company. So this is a message that passes that DMARC check. That's the important thing to remember about DMARC is the alignment is about this from address that the user actually sees in the email client, not necessarily the sending domain, because that envelope sender and the actual display from address that people see in their email client, they can be different. And that is what attackers bank on. And DMARC is there to kind of try to prevent that as much as possible. So hopefully that helps answer that question, but let me know if it still doesn't make sense or you have a follow. This comes down to kind of your preference, honestly, more than even the client's, because ultimately you got to tell the DMARC record, where do you want those XML reports to go? And then what are you going to do with them, right? Your client might not necessarily be doing anything with them. What I would encourage you to do is to explain the importance of it to the client. I know with break fix, it's a little bit different, right? Because now you're potentially introducing a monthly fee to them. In my experience, that is the easiest way to do it, is to, pick one of these DMARC service providers to work with and put that break fix client's domain into the DMARC service and maybe just run it for 2-3 months, right? Just kind of level set for that client, tell them how important it is to have this because it's going to ensure their emails get delivered to their customers. And then maybe you can kind of pull it out if you don't want to have that recurring charge. Otherwise, the alternative is to look for those open source DMARC reporting tools, put that somewhere in that break fix client's environment to collect those XML files out of the mailbox that you deliver to, and kind of see what those reports say and take actions there. Again, that's part of the complexity. One of the disadvantages of DMARC is it does take some upfront time and resources to implement this, but the significance that it has to email security, it's going to be something we're all going to have to do, especially as these large email service providers continue to get closer to making it a requirement. So Mailprotector's record, the DMARC record, we are specifying that DMARC should check 100% of messages that are being sent from mailprotector.com. Okay, so that's something else that you need to keep in mind, is you can actually tell a DMARC policy to only check a certain percentage of messages. Personally, I don't know why you would want to check anything less than 100%, but just so you're aware, that is a control you have. So in Mailprotector's case, all of the messages that we send, the receiving servers that are actually checking DMARC are checking all emails coming from the domain. When those get checked, those email servers that receive the messages and also report back what the DMARC result was, that's what these percentages are saying. So emails that we send from HubSpot, 99.9% of them are coming back with a good DKIM alignment, meaning the DKIM signature was good. The SPF alignment is 0 in this case because of something goofy with HubSpot's SPF record. So we do expect to see that 0. And the compliance rate is basically just saying, of the emails that get sent from this source on behalf of Mailprotector, this is the percentage of those messages that have passed the DMARC compliance check. This is what's also going to tell you where you need to focus, right? So like Amazon SES, that's Amazon's simple email service. Only one message came out that was trying to send on behalf of mailprotector.com. So I'm not too concerned about it, but let's assume maybe this was 1,000 messages. Then I would want to come in here and really identify, like, okay, what am I missing? I don't have an SPF record to tell the world that mailprotector.com emails can come from Amazon SES. It's not doing a DKIM signature, so that's causing a problem as well. These percentages are going to be what tells you where you probably need to focus your effort to make sure alignment for that domain is appropriate for a source that is actually important to that business. Really good question. Not necessarily. So think about something like a multifunction printer scanner device, right? Like some of those really big ones, they actually have a little SMTP server that is embedded into that device. So you can send emails, scans, scan to email or however that multifunction device works. I don't think I've ever come across one that can do DKIM signing. So you have two alternatives. One is don't worry about it. As long as it's delivering maybe internal to the organization, it's not a big deal. Or you have it accounted for in SPF, maybe that's enough to align to the DMARC policy. The other option is instead of using the SMTP server on such a device, or there are even old applications that work this way too, you set up that device or the application to use an email relay like Mailgun, SendGrid, SMTP to go, and maybe they can do the DKIM signatures on behalf of that device. But getting back to your question, DKIM is considered a best practice. It ensures that that message was not messed with. But just because a service doesn't have it, doesn't necessarily mean it's unusable or dangerous. Yeah, that's a great question. So the session we did last month covering SPF and DKIM, we talked a little bit about that. So SPF flattening really comes in handy when you have more than 10 DNS lookups within an SPF record, because that is a limit of that protocol. Honestly, there's so many of them out there, so I don't really have a recommendation. It's the one that you kind of feel most comfortable with. If you're part of a peer group or have other IT professionals that you hang out with that might have some experience with them, I'd actually go to them to see what they use, see what they're most comfortable with. And especially as MSPs, some of them are going to be a little bit more MSP friendly, right? They're going to be multi-tenant ready to help kind of work on that. I think one that I've heard a few of our partners talk about is OnDMARC, I think it's called. They have a pretty good SPF flattening service from what I understand. But yeah, essentially, I would say just take a look at some of the options and see which ones seem the easiest to manage for your needs. Sorry, it's kind of a non-answer, but we we haven't had a whole lot of firsthand experience with it, so I'd hate to make a recommendation without that kind of experience. Wow, yeah, that's a bit of volume. Well, definitely that kind of domain is for sure going to need DMARC, and you're probably going to want that policy to be at the quarantine level as soon as possible. When you're talking about using relays at that kind of volume, your best bet is to probably contact the support of those relay services, because they're going to have actually the better information and the better best practice recommendations on how to configure that kind of volume of email through their service to ensure that you don't run into reputation problems. That type of volume of email is almost a different level of email security, because even the email service providers like Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, they're going to be looking at that kind of domain very differently from a lot of the small and medium-sized businesses that we're accustomed to seeing. So I guess short answer there is contact your relay service that you're using with that client, because their service is going to have to be adjusted to that type of volume. That's a little bit of an advanced topic, but a great question. And I would say it's kind of the next evolution in a best practice for managing messages that come from organizations with specific intent. And what I mean by intent is there's a difference between human to human communication, right? Me sending an email to Mikey, or me sending an email to anybody on this webinar, be it Darren, Kurt, Randall, whoever. Our conversations are looked at differently than an email that is coming from a newsletter or a bulk sending environment. Having those subdomains for things like newsletters or transactional systems, or even like the devices and the applications that are sending emails, the scan to email, the voicemail systems, the security systems, the backup devices, those are different types of emails, and they are looked at in a different way. If you can get to the point of, I guess, a process maturity to put those types of emails on separate subdomains so that they have their own DMARC policies and their own authentication, you're going to improve the deliverability of the human to human communication that all of us rely on so much. So yes, if you can get to that point, I highly recommend getting familiar and comfortable doing that. But I would say by and large, a lot of the small and medium-sized businesses that we see, it's not necessary. I would say the focus on making sure that the primary domain is set up and configured correctly, it's going to probably solve 99% of the email delivery problems that most people. So that's going to be dependent on the service that you work with. So I don't know if Dmarcian has, again, I'm just kind of looking at mailprotector.com. Some providers, so I know like EasyDMARC, I believe OnDMARC, SendMark, I believe those three off the top of my head, all have partner programs. And they do understand that MSPs are managing multiple environments, multiple customers. So yes, there are service providers that do give you kind of that single pane of glass, even though that's not a thing in my book. It does give you that one place to go so that you can manage all of your clients in one place. That is an option. You want to really get into the nitty gritty, you could look up the RFC on these protocols. So let's see, like for example, we do the SPF RFC. So this is about as nitty gritty, nerdy as it gets. So coming in and looking at the actual request for comments on the protocol itself and really diving deep into how it functions, how it works, what's the intent of certain things. It gets into the DNS records themselves, talks about how to handle wildcards, how to handle subdomains, the mechanisms for each of the different flags. So this is kind of like as deep as you can go. If you're looking for something that's a little bit more summarized, but gives you kind of the background on how the DNS lookup is done for an SPF record check, then I think some of those other service providers that have courses on this stuff could be the better resource. Good question. That I don't remember if it defaults to picking up subdomains or not. There is again, that's one of those things where the RFC comes in handy. So there is a flag in DMARC that talks about supporting or acknowledging subdomains. I forget how it works and whether it is on by default or not. Let's see. Okay, relaxed mode can be used in the operators to pick message flows bearing subdomains. Okay, so by default, the policy is in a relaxed mode, which by the way is something that you're going to want, because if you are not sure that you want SPF and DKIM to always align 100% without exception, strict mode is probably going to be something that's too difficult to manage. So based on what I'm seeing here, as long as you have that default relaxed mode on, then it will have a bearing on those subdomains. I believe that there is another flag. So you have policy equals, which is the P equals, I believe it's like SP equals, I think. So you can apply a different policy to subdomains explicitly, but I'd have to refresh my memory and dive into that. So sorry, I don't remember that one off the top of my head. Because email management is really just something you're going to have to do with your managed clients. Kurt makes a great point that DMARC management, because it's becoming so important to deliverability, it's really something that you should just include in your managed service offering. And I would encourage you to understand the costs of it, right? So you're going to have the cost of potentially having something like a Dmarcian or a SendMarc service to collect those reports so that you can take action on whatever's being reported, rather than having to try to sell this type of thing because it's so necessary. It's kind of like trying to sell backup. I don't know of too many partners anymore that sell backup or sell firewall management. Like, it is just such a primary task and responsibility of an MSP. It is just included as part of your MSP service. I think DMARC, SPF, DKIM, like this type of email management should be considered as part of your service. Like, if you become a managed client, we're going to do this for you. Factor in that cost, make it a part of your margin, and make sure you're getting paid, because it is a high value thing. People that aren't taking this seriously, they're going to start having more and more email problems over the next even couple of years, in my opinion. So those MSPs that are understanding this and proactively managing it, their customers are going to be in a much better position to have fewer email problems. So yeah, great point from Kurt. This should absolutely be made as kind of part of your basic service offering. So first question on CloudFilter offering DKIM signing. I don't know. I know that has been talked about. There has been a lot of infrastructure updates to CloudFilter over the last year. With those infrastructure updates, I think it may become more possible for us to have DKIM signing. It's kind of hard to explain, and I'm not a developer either, but there are some difficulties in doing that because that type of infrastructure in CloudFilter, it's not all Mailprotector technology. Like, for anybody that doesn't know, and if you haven't looked at an email header, messages that get sent from CloudFilter, we're using Postfix. Postfix is it's an SMTP service. We would have to basically make sure that Postfix was able to DKIM sign, which is possible. But again, there are customizations and things that Mailprotector does to implement our security services that go beyond just, Postfix sending messages. So it is something that's been talked about and considered, but when it could be added, I don't know. Unfortunately, don't have an answer to that. And then as far as Mailprotector offering a DMARC management solution, also something that has been talked about. There is no timeline or plan to develop that type of tool. But I can tell you we've heard enough partners ask that question that, again, this is part of email security. So it is something that is on Mailprotector's radar. And we're definitely considering what options seem appropriate to bring some value to our partners. This, by the way, for any of you that are going to clients or going to prospects and finding it difficult to talk about email security, Radar is a great tool to start that conversation. What Radar is going to do is you can put your email address in there. Radar is going to send you an email or send your client or prospect an email. You simply reply to that email, and Radar is going to get that message back and do an evaluation of that domain and of that mailbox and give basically like a credit score that tells you and tells your client or prospect their email security posture. That is going to also highlight, like, where are they deficient and why is that important? And we've taken great pains to make sure we've tried to use just plain English, right? And we're not using acronyms. We're not getting like really IT speak in there, so that it's, again, easier for you to have that conversation with your client or prospect, and then maybe segue into the fact that, hey, this is something we offer as part of our managed service so that your email is protected, so that your email is trusted and deliverable to the people that you're trying to send emails to, and all the things that go along with email communication nowadays. So Radar is a great tool. And again, this is free, whether you're a partner or not. You can go to email.security/radar and perform this on any email address that you want to give it a try on. So when you are a partner of Mailprotector, you can also do a little bit of co-branding through the Radar tool, so that when you do perform some of these Radar tests, your brand, your MSP gets a little recognition through that too. So it's another nice way to just kind of put yourself in front of clients and prospects. Thank you, everybody who made time to join us today. I do know DMARC can be a little complex and a little hard to cover in a 1-hour webinar, but hopefully you found this helpful and at least get you maybe moving in the right direction. And again, I do want to encourage everybody, if you're still feeling a little unsure or uneasy about how to use DMARC, go look at some of those providers. Maybe take a look at this recording to just get a once over on it, and try to familiarize yourself with it as best you can, because your clients are going to need this. And the quicker you make this a part of your managed service, the better positioned you and your clients will be for email security and deliverability.